Welcome. And I'm Richard Jorgensen. I'm with Dave Dahlbert, and delighted to have this opportunity for us to present with you today. And we're presenting today on a book that we've been working on throughout the summer, and it is called Becoming a Hybrid Church. This is something that's grown out of our experience working with leaders, with congregations, and it's also grown out of our desire to help all of us consider how we navigate the season and how we will live faithfully into a new time as church together. And Dave, you might want to say a few words.
Sure. Thanks, Richard. Thanks for the opportunity to serve with you, for your friendship and the leadership that you provide in your synod, and the opportunity that you and I have to share this. I'm so grateful for the partnership I share. And of course, many of the people in Lower Susquehanna Synod I've met over the years and had the privilege of working with. One thing I do want to say about this book and really this entire webinar is that we're really fellow learners. That's kind of a disclaimer here that we know what we're doing, sort of. And mostly we've learned by watching, and some of that's been watching people fall flat on their face and saying, oh, don't let that happen to you. Other things have been people who've done some amazing work and we've gone, wow, that is really cool, and other things in between. So as Richard and I share here, really here, we're going to try and be confident and tell you what we know, but really hear a humbleness in between the lines here, because, you know, really, for the most part, before Ash Wednesday, none of us knew what we were doing in this arena, except a few exceptions. And some of those are probably in the audience as part of this bishop's convocation. So there may be some of you who actually know more about this than we do. So we present this with that kind of attitude that we're all kind of fellow learners.
Yeah, and I would say a deep word, first of all, Dave, appreciation to you and appreciation to all of our congregations where we're serving, because I've learned a great deal from all of you, and I'm grateful that we're in this ministry together. And in St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, he writes, I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work among you will bring it to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. And we continue to live with that confidence that God has really begun a good work among us, that we are in the midst of that work, and God is still working for our good. And we trust God, and we trust the goodness of God.
Absolutely.
And I'd invite us to pray. And gracious God, thank you that you have made us your own, that you continue to work for our good in this season. Guide us and use us as you will, and inspire us in this time to listen for your voice amidst our voices, that you continue to make of us a new creation. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Richard. Whoops.
And if anyone had really suggested on Ash Wednesday of 2020 that by Easter Sunday our buildings would be closed, and yet more people would hear the gospel in a single day than ever before in human history, we would not have believed them. And yet that is exactly what happened. Now, I will add, Easter was not canceled and our churches were not closed. But what happened is we were out of our buildings and we were faced with a new challenge. And in the midst of that, there were people who were curious. How is the church going to do this? What's going to happen on Easter? And will worship really take place? Well, in fact, it did. And we were doing some trial and error, but remarkably, we were up, we were running, we were preaching, we were worshiping, and people were listening, and they heard the gospel. And the great news is that we really did it, and we did it to the glory of God.
No, I know that it's just amazing, Richard, when you think about how many people actually watched Easter services and heard Easter preaching online. The statistics seem to point to the fact that in some ways it was the most impactful Easter in history, besides the original one, of course, which triggered all the rest. But we really could never have imagined what was going to happen if we had thought otherwise.
Yeah, and some of the season has been about that we haven't had a choice oftentimes. Well, there is always a choice. We can change or we can die. And sometimes people do choose to die versus the option of change. But the beauty of this is that many of us discovered that we had an urgency, we had to do something, and we found a way to do it. Now, the beauty of the first days of the pandemic is that people many times were surprised that we could do it. And people often celebrated that we were capable, and they said, wow, our leaders are smart. The challenge came later when it seemed like there were multiple choices and multiple options. And suddenly we found that we weren't always of one heart, one mind. And there really is a big difference between responding to a crisis, and it's quite another thing to live into a new reality. And when we started, we thought it was a short-term crisis. In fact, we're living into a new way of being church. And in fact, I would say God is calling us to be a new kind of church. And we're going to look different in the future. And the gospel is still the gospel. God is still God. We still have many of the same calls to make disciples, to bear witness. But what happens in our on-the-ground worship, in our buildings, in our neighborhoods is going to look different. We're discovering new potential for online ministry. And I will add, online ministry is not virtual. If we could cut down on the word virtual, because it's real ministry with real people.
Yeah, Richard, I think that's really important to remind people that when you had a phone call before the pandemic, you didn't say I had a virtual call. You just say I talked to somebody. We've accepted that technology so long that we know that on the phone we have real conversations. But we're still getting used to the idea that now that we can see each other, which is actually a step better, that this is still somehow a pretend kind of a place. And I think that's just so important for people to internalize. Real ministry happens online. Real interactions happen online. Real relationships happen online. Online is in many ways its own real place. And if we can internalize that, it'll really help us be a hybrid church. In fact, if you can't internalize that, you probably can't make the step to being a hybrid church, because you have to take it as legitimately what you do there is what you do in the previous environment and a physical thing. And of course, we'll continue to do physical ministry too.
Yeah, and both have their place and both have the same call that we are to make disciples, we are to bear witness, and we're to love God, we're to love one another.
No, absolutely. Now, one of the things that I think is really important, in some ways, 2020 was just sort of a scramble, wasn't it? If you're watching this and paying attention to this and you're a leader in the church, you know that a big part of 2020 was just scrambling. And Tom Rainer just put this blog out literally a few days ago. And he said, really, we should be thinking about 2021 as a new base year for your church. That if you're going to think about your congregation, and in my congregation, our council met last Monday, we're thinking about budget, and we're thinking about changing staffing, adding tech persons, changing job descriptions, adding money in categories we never had before, moving money from categories to be different. You should really be thinking about, okay, 2020, we were trying to figure out how to get through this. 2021, we sort of have a fresh start on almost everything if we want it. How can I make it a new base church as a leader? How can I work with the leaders in my congregation to make it a base church and cultivate an imagination? If we were going to build a church for the new world in which we know we're going to be living, what kinds of things would we do? Because in many ways, we've got the freedom to start from scratch. And that means we've got to be thinking transformationally, adaptively, in a whole new set of ways. And that's true for every one of us. The beautiful thing about the pandemic, and there aren't very many beautiful things about a pandemic. I mean, it's been a horrific mess, and it looks like we're entering another spike, at least where I live and maybe where you are as well. But this is far from over, and it's going to involve a lot more tragedy and a lot more pain and a lot more of all sorts of horrific things. But the one thing that it really does is it puts us all in the same place. I think we have more chance to be compassionate, to be more sympathetic, to work together, because in many ways it's not like, oh, the big church, they got this, and oh, the little church has that, and oh, the church in the city's got that, but the church in the country has that. No, actually, we all have a pandemic, and while we all have different things to do with, we're actually all scrambling, we're all learning. There's a real opportunity for us to think about church differently, and that even means the together part of church, the cooperative, collaborative things. It's been a real equalizer in terms of how things function. So it's going to be adaptive time for all of us. And I hope we really all do seize the opportunity to help each other and learn from each other and support each other as we go through this. Um, I want to talk a little bit about adaptive leadership processes. Adaptive leadership is really about engaging reality with the goal of transforming. So you have to really pay attention to what's going on, and you have to interpret it. You have to put some sort of lens on it, give yourself a paradigm or a way of making sense of it. And then when you've made sense of it, then you can say, okay, based on how I understand this at a deeper level, I can make these kind of actions happen, these kind of interventions. So you watch and you think about it and you interpret it, and eventually you decide we're going to do this, and you act. In many ways, you act based on some understanding, but then you have to watch again because it's a lot of experimentation. So you re-observe, did it work? Did we understand it correctly? Were there things we didn't? You're constantly learning and interpreting and intervening. It's kind of a way of being in the world. And adaptive leadership is a pretty new term. Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky coined it in like 2009, but it's a framework. It's a leadership framework, and it helps us adapt and thrive in challenging environments. And if there's anything about the pandemic, it's challenging, and in some awful ways that are painful, but in some ways that will accelerate the changes that we would have had to do anyway. And if we do it well, the church we have could be quite amazing in the process. So I want to see these four keys as adaptive leadership pieces. And I think they're important. Number one, adaptive leadership is grounded in character. People have to trust you, because people don't risk, they don't share, they don't do anything else if they don't trust you. If you don't tell the truth, if you don't treat them with integrity, if you don't apologize when you mess up, if you don't have the character and the honesty to respect people, the whole thing falls apart. Grounded in that then is organizational justice, where people know that they can trust you. And so they actually will come to you and share ideas. It doesn't matter whether they're the pastor or the council president, or it's a maintenance person or a person in a particular group, an active person who's been there for 60 years or a newer person who's just kind of testing things out. There's a real sense that everybody's voice and everybody's person matters. Then you take what you're hearing, what you're seeing, what you're sensing from across the board with people, and you develop an organization that's a learning organization. And you learn from hearing, you learn from observation, you learn from trying things. You fall flat on your face and you say, well, why did that fail? Not bang, shame on you. But okay, what did we learn? And that requires a certain degree of resilience, emotional intelligence, where instead of freaking out when things don't go well, we're able to work through it, to support one another, to learn without panicking, and to maintain some sense of stability emotionally. Not that emotions don't matter, but that the emotions that we feel are processed in healthy ways. And then we move through them and even learn from those emotions what it is that's going on so that we can do this. So these four keys are essential. And without them, and I would just reiterate character again. For those of us who are key leaders in a system, your character and my character, can people trust us? Do people trust us? It is really the foundational place where everything else does or doesn't fall in adaptive leadership.
And I know you're going to speak about it later. The piece on this that's so essential also is our capacity to be gracious with each other.
Absolutely. We'll talk about that more. But yeah, when you fall flat on your face, that's part of emotional intelligence. Emotionally immature people, when things go wrong, they blame, they beat up, they deflect. And emotionally mature people kind of live in what is and process and deal with it in healthy ways. Absolutely, Richard. I think that's really important. And we'll say it again later. You're right. But it's actually the kind of thing that it doesn't hurt to be reminded more than once. We are gospel people. We are gracious with each other. We're not always going to say the right words. We're not always going to think the first idea won't be the best. We're not always going to respond. But if we don't follow up at some point with grace, we sort of deny the whole reality of who we are. And that includes, Richard and I. When you're listening to this presentation, please be gracious with us, because we're probably going to say some things wrong and botch things up. We all need grace together. On the other hand, technical changes are a little different. They're more straightforward. Somebody who's an expert and understands how the system currently works well. Maybe your Wi-Fi goes down, and instead of just saying, well, let's see if we can figure out what's going on, you get somebody who understands Wi-Fi, tests it out, gets a new router, replugs in a cable, reboots something, whatever it is, and gets things back operating. And if people are really good at this, they can make it operate not just the way it was, but better. So it's not that technical things are bad, but that they matter. And so this final little piece on this section that we really want to talk about is it's not technical versus adaptive like it's a contest. But the real key is technical or adaptive is a question. What kind of problem are you facing? And recognizing that. And then if the issue is about fixing or improving something from where it's at, you're probably dealing with a technical solution. Put the expertise in the right place, ask the questions to diagnose it or improve it, and then make the action happen. But if it's about, wow, this is totally new, and we should be thinking more of these, not less, then it's a more deeper systemic, we need creativity kind of thing. Then you're dealing with adaptive leadership. And the key for leaders is to recognize, am I dealing with a technical problem or an adaptive issue? And if it's a technical one, get the right people. If it's adaptive, start the right processes and thinking. And also don't forget, when you do adaptive change, every adaptive change is going to shift the system. It takes a lot of communication, a lot of caring, a lot of processing, because people will still be watching many things from the old system. They won't understand it. So that takes a lot of work. At the same time, every time you decide what to do, eventually you have to do it. Every solution, including adaptive, has technical things. Eventually, if you change how you organize, you're going to create governance and you're going to create processes and whatever those things are. So always be asking the question underneath, why? Okay, why are we doing this? And when you understand why you're doing it, it'll help you determine whether it's technical or adaptive. It will also help people go deep enough to do good ministry. Because in the end, good ministry isn't just something that's implemented, it's actually understood. We don't just do something, we do things on purpose. And we think about why we do it from God's perspective, from a sense of mission, from a sense of commitment, from a sense of purpose, from the values we share. All those things have to be lived out.
Yeah, and we do it with a sense of purpose and always with an eye on the relationships, our relationship with God and with each other, and that these are always grounded in love.
Yeah, and
And
Richard,
whatever we
actually, if you
do.
talk about this slide here, I think is really important. I think, Richard, you should probably maybe share about this because I think it's what you're talking about right here.
Yeah, and I think some of the things that I would encourage us to remember is that allow space for creativity. We ought to do experiments. If you do an experiment and you know how it's going to turn out, it's not really an experiment. So this is a great time to try new things, and it's a great time to change our language, because we might fail in an experiment, but did we really, or did we learn? And I think that's the piece. The other thing I want to say is that when we try new things, we will feel awkward sometimes. And if we are doing ministry in such a way that we never feel awkward, then we probably aren't doing what we should be doing. Because
Bob Logan likes to say, if you don't feel awkward doing something new, you're probably not doing something new.
yeah, and I think that awkward space is that space where we're learning. And it's sometimes such a gift to be there. And again, I would just say it's always so important, and I know, Dave, you will as well, that we practice grace, that we practice compassion, we practice mercy with each other. If we're grounded in the character of who we are as people of God, and we really are, then this is really essential to who we are. And it's just a new way for us to be church together.
You bet. Well, as we finish this section, Richard, we've got some questions here, and I hope the people who are listening and sharing this with us today will just take a few moments to reflect, maybe a little space, reflect on what Richard and I just talked about. What caught your attention or maybe made you say, aha? What did we say, if anything, that you found kind of challenging? And then out of that, really think about what ideas come to mind for what you'd consider in the setting where you serve. Are people adaptive? Do they need help? Is it a learning environment? Do they need help? Is it a place where people are gracious with each other? Do they need help? To begin to think about those issues, because the post-COVID church is going to have to try a lot of things, and being adaptive, being competent, being gracious, learning, all those things are going to be critical. So we're going to pause this, just leave you some space for a few minutes.
And then you may want to take some notes that you may want to bring to the question and answer time.
Absolutely. That's a great suggestion, Richard, that when we come back, bring your notes, because it may be in the Q&A, which Richard and I will have live after this. You've got some great ideas. I think that's really helpful. And then we'll see you back in a few minutes, hopefully with your notebooks going and some thoughts and things. And especially in the Q&A, I think if you bring some things, it may be that Richard and I learned a lot of things too. So thanks. We'll be back with you in a little bit.
Be blessed.
I'm recording.
And welcome back. And in this next segment, we're going to talk about worship in the hybrid church. And what's remarkable is that since the beginning of the pandemic, the ways that we have gathered and the ways that we have thought of worship have shifted dramatically. And prior to the pandemic, significantly less than 10% of the congregations in the ELCA actually offered online worship in any form. And oftentimes when the issue was brought up, folks would say, well, we don't need to. Or we would say our focus is on the people who are here. And the other thing that I noticed was that as we lived into this, I will add, I've learned a lot in the past 7 months about this. This has been a wonderful learning curve for me and a learning curve for so many of us. And at this point, it's somewhere in the 60% range for
I think that's right.
ELCA
About
congregations.
2/3 of church worship is now, the congregations are having online. About a third roughly aren't. That's not a judgment. Some can't. Some made other choices, etc. But right now, about a third of congregations are not online for worship, and about 2/3 are. That's right, Richard.
Yeah, and the other part of it is the ways in which we worship online have shifted as well. Because prior to the pandemic, we had congregations that would broadcast a live stream of their in-person worship, but it was basically a broadcast of a worship service, and it was not specifically an online service designed
Really, it was
specifically.
more for people who were homebound or couldn't come, and because actually it's not very good TV by itself, so probably it wasn't so much an outreach, although people may have considered it that, but it was really more for people who couldn't be there, especially older people who had access to internet but couldn't come to worship, so they could see and participate that way.
And I've had at least a few young adults over the recent months saying it is not exciting to watch other people commune. And I would say I'm not a young adult, and it's not exciting to watch other people commune.
Right, and that's why I think this information, Carrie Newhoff, who's one of the kind of consultants who's been following and working hard on this, said this last week on an engagement seminar that he had online. He said a lot of people used to use online to get people to come to the building. In other words, it was an attraction thing. But in the future, pastors will use the building to reach people online. In other words, the target, the audience, the action will be focused on people not coming to church, but actually church coming to people. And that whatever you do needs to be accessible to unchurched people out in the world. Prior to the pandemic, as excited as we were about the people who came to our congregations, only about 12 to 14% of Americans come to church in any given week prior to the pandemic. And the estimates are that number will be cut in half after the pandemic, that your worship attendance will be closer to 50% of what it was. That's post-pandemic at its recovery point, that we're going to lose a lot of people. So whatever you do, Zoom, Facebook Live, whatever, if you're doing it and it isn't really thinking about the people out there as an actual group of people, that they can't find you, they can't access you, you're not thinking about them in terms of the work you're doing, you're probably doing it wrong.
And one of the things that I would add is sometimes in the past, when we thought of how we would have used online, it was sort of like having a funnel that you would, try to get people to come through the funnel to come into the building. And it was almost a narrowing.
Right.
And in some ways, what's happened is we've shifted our vision. Rather than bringing people into the building, we are taking the building, we are taking the ministry into the world. And it's almost a recapturing of the vision of, let's say, the book of Acts, where all the best stories are on the road.
Right, which is why things like this are so important, Richard. Like this is a congregation that I know fairly well, not mine. I've covered the faces of people. I'm not here to shame anybody, but this is what you see for an hour and 5 minutes every week in this congregation. Camera doesn't move, it's stationary. You can see it's actually a fairly good image. The people stand at those two music stands or sit at the chairs, depending what they're doing, the entire hour. They do online communion in this congregation. I'm not going to say whether that's a good or a bad thing. It's just true. You can make your own mind up on that issue, but they go and they move from behind the music stand to behind the altar, and the camera never moves. There's not a close-up. There's not anything. And so think about what people are watching. And while it might work to keep your members, the members of this congregation watch, they stay engaged because they love the church and they're glad something's coming to them. If you were a new person and just scanning through the internet, would you stay and watch this basically still life picture for an hour and 5 minutes while they do a bunch of stuff that's frankly from a spectator perspective, not very interesting. On the ground worship is not designed for online viewing, and that's a visual thing and it's a liturgical thing. Watching church is boring. And be honest, if you were to talk to some of the people in your congregation, being in church for some people is already boring when we were physically there. And I can take credit for boring so many people over the years, so I understand that. But you have to rethink the whole thing. You have to spend time thinking, what are they seeing? What are they doing? What are they hearing? What are they experiencing? And it has to be shorter, crisper. It just has to be different. That means we have to adjust our liturgy. What used to be good song leadership, and one thing is really bad karaoke when you're just listening to the song leaders perform on what would be basically a TV thing. So are your music things that you're using, is it good song leadership, or are people not really, and it's just bad karaoke? Preaching, when I used to tell a joke, I could tell if it bombed. If I told a sad story, I could tell if people's eyes watered up. Online, I can't. The interaction is different. So you have to reimagine interaction and rethink what it means to preach. We're going to start recording worship differently. So I'm going to need to have my Sunday sermon recorded by Thursday. But if we ever come back to live, I'll be giving the same text sermon on Sunday. My mind works that sometimes the day of, I find the last piece of my sermon. It's like a spiritual rhythm for a week for me. What does it mean for me to start preaching next Wednesday's sermon this Wednesday while keeping this sermons for Sunday going till Sunday? I haven't had to deal with 2 sermon overlaps, but if I'm recording, so all the adjustments we have to make are incredible. And don't assume that the liturgy that worked when people were there works the same online. Almost everybody agrees responsive readings online are a catastrophe, even though responsive reading might be a beautiful thing in person when people are actually physically together. So you have to really online rethink everything. That might be a blessing. Because you can say, okay, what does it mean to gather people here? What does it mean to hear the word and preach it here? What does it mean to share in table if you're working on some kind of an online experience of the Eucharist? What does it mean to send people forth in mission in the world? Those 4 basic elements. The liturgy can still be the liturgy, but how do you do it differently? And it might be a blessing because maybe you'll think of things that are better to do in person. As well. We can't sing right now because of the pandemic. If we were to come back, we wouldn't sing. And we're still not physically in our building. We only have online. How do you do all those things? And what do you learn by being online? It says, I could make worship more engaging in the physical gathered space as well, from what I learned from how to engage people online. So just think about those engagement things and how you do that. And there's different ways to do that and put that together.
And one of the conversations we sometimes have is what's the best way to go online? And there's advantages to each of these 2. And I might also just name something else as well. But the live streaming, it happens live, and I will add, I like the energy you have with that when you're live, and it's happening in real time. We're experiencing it together. But I will add, another option is the synchronous release viewing, and the beauty of that is we record it ahead of time, but we watch it together. And the piece in either of these, though, is that you need to have the space where people can chat, where they can comment, where they can interact. And I think it's really important that congregations have people who are either staff or either paid or unpaid staff, but people who are committed to interacting with worshipers, who are creating space to help cultivate community. And I've seen folks who do this so very well, the way they create community.
No, that's right, Richard, that if you can't engage people, remember, no matter what quality you're putting together, in most cases, if you're honest and just watch it, like comparing yourself to a reasonably well-produced TV program, in most cases, all of us are producing subpar TV. So it doesn't mean it's bad because it's about something else, but it's going to be about relationships and engagement. Because if you're trying to compete with the kinds of things that you see in well-produced television stuff, most of us just don't have the staff or the time or the resources to produce it at that quality. At the same time, most of us do have the staff and the learning curve to continually improve the quality we are producing, and to also develop energy on relationships. And I would say you should keep improving the quality of your work, but really work on those relationships. So I'm gonna start with quality first. You gotta spend some time and money. Our congregation and our council just Monday night spent about $6,800 on technology and social media pieces. Pulled money out of a piece that we had from somebody who gave some money for something. We took some money out of memorial funds to do some things. You know, you got to kind of rob Peter to pay Paul and kind of do things. But the reality is you do have to spend some money. That the iPhone that you took and used for that first broadcast to get things up by Easter may not be the permanent solution. If you're going to have good online work, you can invest in different kinds of pan zoom tilt Vivo cameras, whatever else kinds of things you're going to be doing, thinking about software and all those kinds of things. Because remember, while you're producing whatever you're producing so that people can worship together online, people do have choices. And we now know from some surveys that about 25% of all people who attend most congregations actually watch worship on some congregations other than the one that they attend. They might still watch yours, but 25% are watching and looking at other congregations online stuff. And there's some really good quality. If you were to go to Shepherd of the Valley in Apple Valley, Minnesota, and look at sotv.org and look at what they produce each week, big congregation, 5 rostered leaders, technical people on staff, all that. It's an excellently well-produced, liturgically framed service, properly and well done from a technology standpoint. And if people can say, well, I'm just going to watch the best one, they're eventually they're all going to gravitate to 10 to 20 Lutheran services around the country, and the rest of us are all going to be second fiddle. But you do have to produce good quality, and you do have to put things together so you can engage people, because relationships, not everybody can have a relationship with every place. Ministry is about people, not about technology. So I would urge you to start watching. My wife and I, every week, we do live stream right now. So our worship is live online. We don't have a gathered worship physically, but only we gather online. But we come home, we make a sandwich, and we sit down and we scan through 2 or 3 worship services: Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal, United Church of Christ, non-denominational, big churches, little congregations, city places, country places. We just kind of scan around and look for stuff. And, Richard, you said briefly about how your daughter watches worship. Could you just give us a 10-second snippet of how your daughter watches worship? It's really helpful for people.
Yeah, and my daughter has shared that when she watches worship, she especially pays attention to the music. She's a musician, and she listens to the sermon. And she also adds that she's at home. So she says, I do the readings myself. I can do the prayers myself. And so one of the things we may want to think about is, as we prepare our worship, we may want to prepare it with the reality, with the awareness that people watch it differently. So maybe we want to give people tools to be able to worship in their home and use some of the pieces we provide to enhance that.
That's really helpful. The other thing I watch for, especially because I'm trying to figure out, remember, if you're trying to create an environment for worship, segues are really important. Whether you edit them. So I actually watch how people do transitions and the aesthetics of places. Some places just look like cluttered catastrophes out of 1863. And other places look really crisp and together. So I look at worship environments, and I've changed my own because I watched something and it was bad. And I thought, but ours isn't much better. So we had to change some things. Our segues and transitions, how do they do it? Oh, that's better than ours when we've learned how to do things. So go on and learn, be curious, and see what you can find out. The other thing is pay attention. Not only do you pay attention, but are other people paying attention? You can get good stats from Facebook or YouTube. You can get Google Analytics on your website, and you should have those. I'd urge you to take the free Google Analytics tools and put them on for sure. And I'd urge you probably to spend the money to upgrade to at least the next level in whatever Google Analytics apps you're using. Start watching screen views and use the longest one. Like Facebook tracks 3-second screen views. That means the screen went active while somebody scrolled by. No, if it's not a minute screen view, just assume that either you were so bad they didn't stay, or they were scrolling through, and don't blame yourself. But watch how long they watch. You might have 100 screen views, and the average screen view, when they average it all out, is 1 minute and 1 second. Whoa, it was a 43-minute service. What's the deal? Well, 80 people watched a chunk of it. 40 people watched a smaller chunk of it, and all those 3-second views get averaged in and they kill you. So watch those things. Look at the trends. Are people staying online longer? Are more people watching now than watched at Easter? Most of us, to be honest, are estimating too high. Real attendance numbers are probably smaller. So use that longest screen view and a multiplier that's not real big. And really doesn't matter what your multiplier is. The real question is, are there number of screen views this week higher or lower than they were 3 months ago or the next 3 months? So you can tell if you're engaging people and connecting people in, or if you're starting over time to lose people and weaning people out. And I think that's really key.
And one thing I would just add by way of advice, don't compare yourself to other churches. Don't say they're getting 300 views, we're getting 100 views. What's wrong with us? This is really just about learning about your own views
Right. And I think
and
it's
how
like
you
golf or
engage.
bowling. I think of it as golf and bowling. You know, when I golf, I'm kind of a bogey golfer. So for me, if I shoot a typical round would be a 90. If I shoot an 86, I had a great day, even if the guy I golfed with had an 81. And if I had a 96, I had a so-so day, even if the guy I golfed with had 103. Because it depends who you're golfing. You really, these are things about yourself, and just look at the trend. Don't compare yourself to the biggest church or the fanciest church or this. Just look at yourself and say, where are we, and where are we moving? What's happening to us? Are we maturing? Are we growing? Are we engaging? And is this making progress in the right direction? Remembering that the longest journey begins with a single step. The other thing is just watch passive engagement. If you're doing Facebook Live, for example, how many people like, how many people love, all those kinds of things. But try to move towards active engagement. Try to get people engaging in comments, and really watch, are people sharing? Because a like is nice. It kind of strokes your ego, but a share means it actually moved out. And you want all of these numbers to be moving up over time. One of the things you can do, and Richard alluded to this already, this is a clip from our children's sermon last week. My wife was talking, she was teaching a table prayer as part of that. And over here, here's somebody responding to something that was said in it. One of my biggest problems is when I want something to happen, I want it now. I don't want to wait. And then we have a staff person on the line. Her name's Allison. You're not alone. Lots of us have that issue. So in real time, something happens and these kind of comments come out. Just try to foster conversations, engage people. When somebody comes on and says, I'm here, say hello, Ellie, or whatever those things are. The real key isn't, are you putting on TV? The real key is worship happening in a way that's creating community and connecting people with God and with each other. And the way that you need to do that is not by people watching, but by people interacting. And you can control a lot of that interaction by being there to interact. It's one of the beautiful things about the synchronous viewing is, if you're the pastor who preached that Sunday, you can preach on Thursday, get it in and have it all recorded and set up. And at 9:30 or 10, it gets released. Everybody watches it. You can actually be online with people as they watch your sermon. And you can make snide comments about your own sermon. That was a tough spot there, wasn't it? Or, as I thought about this after giving it, I wondered this, and you can ask a question. What do you all think? And then get people to follow up with their own answers and things. So be conscious that there's some real advantages to synchronous viewing of a recorded thing. If the staff who are in worship will also be online when it's broadcast, you can now go from being a presenter to an engaging participant, which is really what you were when you were the liturgical leader, I hope, on the physical kind of gathering before. So the last thing I want to say is, remember, this engagement is a key to finding new people. Speak to visitors online. So say things routinely, like, if you're worshiping online with us for the first time, we're so glad you're here. One congregation that I've been watching and things has contact cards on their website and a clear connection with the link on their broadcast when they stream. And they say, we'll make a food bank. Every new contact that comes in every Sunday, we make a $5 donation to our new food bank. So if we get 10 new contact cards, we're going to send $50 to the food pantry. And every week they do this. And so there's an incentive for you to sign up because somebody benefits besides even the ministry. The other thing, ask them questions. If you can ask a question and somebody comments, then their name's there. So suppose Jane Doe is watching and doesn't do anything. If you can get Jane Doe to like it, then you can go down your Facebook thing and see all the people who liked it, and you go, gee, I don't know who Jane Doe is. Now you can interact with Jane Doe because she's identified herself as being there. So use polls, information gathering, questions. I'm getting ready to start a new series of events, like one-time educational things online. And I'm going to ask people, okay, we're going to do 6 one-night events on 6 different topics. What would you like us to talk about? And I'm going to hope that people say education, politics, environment, spirituality, prayer, whatever those things are. But when they do it, their name comes out. Now I can interact with them. I could even go and do other things. So that's what we've got on this section, Richard. You want to kind of lead us into the kind of pause moment here?
Yeah, and and again, to give you, take a few moments, catch your breath. And again, what were the things in this time period that made you say, aha, what would you like to know more about? What were the things that could have been challenging? I will add, we all have been humbled in this season, and it's okay. And then, most of all, though, what would be a place where you might want to try something new where you are? And again, we invite you to write some notes, bring some questions, and also in weeks to come, feel free to call on us because we're learning together and we're happy to help you continue to learn as we move through this. So I'd say let's take a breather. And in this time, also, please be blessed. A friend of mine over the years has often observed that Jesus used small groups to change the world. And I always found that to be a powerful insight, that Jesus invested in relationship, that he invested in knowing people at an intimate level. And the other part that I always appreciate about the stories of how Jesus interacts with people is that he was in conversation with people. He was listening, he was speaking. And I think all the best conversations we have involve both speaking and listening. And one of the challenges sometimes as we move into the online platform is that we know how to interact when we're in a building. We know how to interact when we see people. It became a bit more challenging when we went online. At first, it was enough we were able to do worship. And it was sort of like a broadcast or a TV program, but we know we're about something deeper than that. And now it's about how do we engage people at a deeper level, that they're not just an audience, but we're a community together.
I think that's right, Richard. I think that really the key here is to figure out how to meet people, to both listen to them and to speak to them in a way that builds a reciprocal kind of relationship where there's some mutual benefit, there's a genuine mutuality. And we're not always as good at that online as we are in the, of course, in the divisiveness of social media. Sometimes we're more using it as a platform as opposed to a relationship, and we use it to share an idea. And I see a lot of that. So thinking about all this together, I think the other thing that's important is people need more than Sunday to live a Christian life. And new people, if all you really have is a way for existing people to gather, maybe even in small groups, and you have Sunday worship as your only public space, then there is no on-ramp to congregational life. And the reality is that if you're going to meet people online, then you have to provide on-ramps where people can get involved in congregational life. And small groups, both physically gathered ones and online ones and hybrid ones, which we'll talk about as well, where there may be some people who are zooming in online on a monitor while other people are in the same room physically. These are critical places for new people to build relationship and for existing people to maintain those. So be thinking about them from that perspective.
And the other thing I would add is that as the church, we are always trying to invite people to go deeper. And small groups really become an opportunity to do that. And the beauty of it is that in a small group, we are able to help people stay connected with each other. And it's a place where relationship happens. It's a place where deep change happens. It's a way for us to pay attention to how God is at work with us and in our lives. And I find it to be one of the most powerful places to nurture faith. Worship is, by the way, I love worship, but I've found that often some of the most important transformation I've seen in people's lives has taken place in small groups. It's also a place where people have been able to support each other, encourage each other. And I hope that every small group has a vision in itself of how we take this relationship out. How do we take this out into the world, that we serve our neighbor, that we serve the gospel, that it's always about something more than us, because it is. It's
No,
about
absolutely,
us,
Richard.
but more than us.
I think that's right. That if we don't think of it as more than ourselves, but about ourselves, we can easily get into kind of spiritualized secular humanists if we're not careful, as opposed to viewing ourselves as connecting with God and then extending the ministry of Jesus through the incarnation in our own lives. And groups are a way to kind of help people reflect on that and then do that because they've got these accountable, meaningful partnerships.
Yeah, and part of this too is to recognize that we have small groups already. They're taking place in all sorts of ways. But one of the things I would want us to notice is just some of the forms of small groups we have and the things that happen there, whether it's spiritual formation, whether it's equipping people for servanthood as an opportunity. When you speak of the on ramp, it's one of the ways we're going to do evangelism. But one of the other things I've noticed too is that one of the gifts that has been emerging in this season has been the increasing number of affinity groups I've seen in our synod and throughout the church. And this becomes an opportunity for people to gather and to gather in ways that maybe they're learning about something, being equipped for something. But more than that, it's about always, all of these things take place in the gospel. So within our own synod, I'm just, these are some of the things that I've seen, that we have groups that are focused on caring for creation and racial justice, LGBTQIA plus, and how are we equipping allies? How are we making space for young adults and for grief and for divorce? And to be honest with you, we could put another half dozen categories here, but part of it is, what is it that we can identify with? And it's about relationship, it's about gospel, and it's about becoming more and more the people we're called to be.
And I'll be this kind of beating a drum for on ramps. We have my wife runs a small group for spiritual practices on Thursday mornings in our congregation. My wife's a rostered deacon. So tomorrow morning she'll have a group online. Tomorrow night we have a racial justice affinity group that meets, and that group will be doing some things related to racism and covenanting and being an anti-racist organization and inclusive and cultural competence, all those things. And there's a woman who got re-energized in our congregation by being involved in the affinity group for spiritual practices that meets in the morning. But she's a trainer and a social worker in our school district for racism and anti-racism and cultural competency. And she got connected with this, re-energized through one group, heard about the other, said, I want to be on that. So tomorrow night she'll be at the racial justice. She's a woman that's a very talented person, but has been less engaged in congregational life really for a couple of years when we were physical. Now we're online, and there's affinity groups she's connected with, and she's in 2 of them and going to be a real resource. So these are real opportunities to take people who've been off-ramped or maybe not connected at all and bring them back on. Don't ever think that this isn't like the real deal. Because this is a woman who's not been as involved and connected, but sees some real opportunities. And wow, these affinity groups and the fact that we can do things online, she's jazzed.
And Dave, I would notice a couple things about that is that her life is being changed and you're engaging her gifts more deeply. So one of the gifts of these affinity groups too has been that we are recognizing this wide range of gifts in the body of Christ that we had often not always been able to appreciate as fully as we could. And it's a really powerful way of living into our call to
Absolutely.
be just people.
No, she's being cared for and she's feeling useful.
Yeah. And so another thing I do want to lift up in terms of our affinity groups, and this has been a key piece in many of our churches, has been also that in our small groups, they provide this opportunity for care because it's relationship. And so sometimes where I see one individual, the pastor or the deacon, trying to do the care for an entire community, that was never how it was intended to be. So as we live into small groups, we have a network and a community in which we care for each other. And so I see this as pieces that are interconnected, and it really makes our ability to care for one another that much more effective, that much more faithful.
You know, Richard, one of the things I've seen in the pandemic, and it's kind of a sad commentary on the state of the church before in many ways, but many congregations have started talking to people who don't come to worship because of the pandemic. They said, oh man, our people aren't going to feel connected. We should start calling people and talking to people. So they went through the directory and started calling people, including people who weren't coming to worship that they weren't calling before in the first place. And one of the things the pandemic has done is made us very clear about the importance of relationships. And we've put some relationships on that we had been very lazy at. Um, Members who hadn't been in worship for months or years were suddenly getting a phone call from a member saying, well, during the pandemic, and they were often appreciative because the pandemic gave them an excuse to call without having to say, I know we should have called 2 years ago, but we really haven't given a rip about you until the situation made it happen. But the pandemic gave us a new kind of a clean slate, an opportunity to do some things over. And a lot of people who were not very active felt cared for again and have been reconnecting. I hear story after story of people because congregations have been much more intentional. So this online opportunity has really improved congregational care in many places, expanding who's doing all kinds of things. Richard, you want to share about your experience in bringing in somebody from a group, and you had someone from Houston get connected. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, and one of the things, since we are talking about becoming a hybrid church, I really think we would be remiss not to mention that we can do things in ways we've never done them before. And right now I have a small group that originally was exclusively in the building. We were an on the ground small group. When we entered the crisis, we became exclusively online. And now we're at a phase in this time in which we are both on the ground and online and at the same time. It's one group, and we have people who gather physically on site, and this does depend on having a good camera, a good microphone, and someone who's willing to be host. But meanwhile, most of the people are still online. And the beauty of being online, and you're going to talk about boosting in the next segment, but one of the beauties of being online is that you can send out invitations and they can travel. And so, yes, we've connected. We have someone who regularly comes to our group now who lives in Houston, Texas. We have people who live in other counties who regularly participate. And the amazing thing is that this group of folks that currently gathers has never all been in the same physical space at one time. And yet we now feel a sense of deep community together. And it really does make a difference in people's lives.
Absolutely.
That we're able to be grouped together. And, I think one other thing that we really want to recognize is that small groups can be done anywhere. And sometimes I've had folks from small congregations say, well, our congregation's a small group. And that may be true. But I'd like to say that congregations any size can do this. And Dave, I think you also.
I want to really dig in. In fact, I'm going to chastise all of us, probably, or many of us. Most of us have spent so much time and energy trying to get worship on that we've forgotten that the reality is that worship requires a quality engagement in terms of equipment and thinking things through and access to technology and time and energy that's really hard to do. And to be honest, all of us need to continue to really work, and worship is a big area of growth. But we really have no excuse for not doing small groups well. Worship is a big learning curve, but you should already know how to do a small group, right? I mean, I know how to do a small group. You get 6 or 8 people together, you pick something to talk about. If you're a good facilitator, you do those kinds of things to get everybody talking. You have some snacks maybe so people can eat together. You pray at the end, and you try to have some sense of purpose and mission. But online small groups are so accessible. And we have people who come to small groups who would never have come to groups before because it took too long to drive to be at the group. So honestly, I want to say that most of us spent too much time and energy on worship and neglected small groups in many cases. We should be forming new small groups. You can do small groups as well at your congregation because 6 or 8 people can get together on Zoom at your church just as well as they can at some mega church. And the quality will be 100% as good. And probably the theology and practice may be better than a lot of those mega churches, right? Because we think our content and understanding the gospel is great stuff. So reality is all of us can do small groups better than many of those mega churches. We probably can't with them for technology and worship and all those things, but we can do this. Every one of us can do this. We can make space. We can create relationships. It's not about size when it's a small group. It's about intentionality. And that's what I really want to urge us all to do, to be much more intentional in this area. Richard, you were going to say something also.
Yeah, and intentionality, and also to recognize our ability to partner with each other right now. that if you're trying to do an affinity group and you say, well, we don't have anyone who does, really understands this. You might have a neighbor church that does, and now distance doesn't matter because your neighbor church could be 50 miles away.
My wife has people on her spiritual practices from 4 different congregations, and including 2 people who come pretty rarely who are from no congregations. So absolutely, the possibilities are really endless in this, and we just want to cultivate your imagination, and as we do, to get you thinking about this again.
And have fun.
Have a good time with this and play with it, because small groups are really meaningful. So as we finish this, I just want to encourage you the same thing. What did you hear as we thought about this segment that caught your attention or made you say, aha? What did we say that was challenging? Maybe it even kind of went, oh, what? I don't think so, or whatever. And then think about what are the ideas that come to mind for what you could be doing in your setting to enhance the quality and the quantity really of small groups. We're going to pause this for a little bit and give you some time, and then we'll come back in a few minutes and have our last section together. Thanks for being with us, and thanks for the sharing that you're going to do as you share what you reflect.
Welcome back. And I think one of the things that we're continuing to learn about is how we use social media in the hybrid church. And it is evolving. It was at one time something if we simply had a Facebook page or a website. But today we're discovering that alone is not enough. And Dave, I think you've really spent a fair amount of time with this.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think one of the things is there's a lot of platforms out there, and it's easy to get enamored and get an account. And my congregation has a Facebook account, a YouTube account, a Twitter account, an Instagram account. We don't have a TikTok account, but we don't use our Twitter account. It was too much. So you should only use what you can keep up with. And recognize that part of this, the audience that you're trying to connect with and reach. Facebook tends to be pretty adult now. The number of younger people that's on it has decreased percentage-wise, but baby boomers and some of the Gen X folks are heavily on. Of course, there's still millennials and high school kids on it, but in terms of Instagram has a younger audience. That's where you're going to probably connect more with young adults and with teenagers. And then just don't skip YouTube no matter what you do. If you're using Facebook Live, find a way to get your videos over, because YouTube is the largest searchable video platform. If somebody's looking for something and it's a video something, they're not going to go to Facebook and scan a bunch of different pages and read all those videos. They're going to go to a searchable database. They're going to go to YouTube and type in something, and it's going to happen. So, think about what you're using, but only use what you can keep up with. And by keep up with, I mean relate to. That's not even a weekly post. It's something much more meaningful than, whoops. So engagement's really the issue. And Richard, you were on this engagement seminar with Carrie Newhoff, and Nona was there. Talk about what you experienced and what you heard Nona saying.
Yeah, and one of the things that is really significant is early on we were saying, how many views did we have? How many people watched us? But now it really comes down to, how are people engaging with us? Are they communicating with us? Because it's not just enough for us to make a statement. Really, sometimes it's more useful for us to ask a question, see how people respond to us, but also how are people viewing us? What are they seeing? And really, are we having an impact with people?
Absolutely. And that's the key. So one of the things you have to do is figure out how to move from Sunday to Monday. And so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever you're using, do something. This is an Instagram post and a Facebook post from 2 weeks ago. We're using the narrative lectionary. And I concluded my sermon with these words. One of the things we did is, our secretary's job now is, she's online on Sundays, and she is with our congregation's interactive person in the comment section. So, because we live stream, I can't be there because I'm on camera and streaming. So she's there, and part of her job now is every Sunday she welcomes people, makes comments. She listens to the sermon and jots things down, and then she pulls back up the video on Monday and pulls a quote out, and she puts a quote up and posts it. Different things. This just happens to be the one that posted not yesterday or this last week, but 2 weeks ago in our case. And then we've taught people to do things with it so that it goes up on Facebook and Instagram. And then what happens is people have to learn what to do with that. If we put that on our Facebook page and our Instagram page and our members see it, what should they do? So it's really important to equip people to do things. It's fine if your people are watching on let's say Facebook Live, but teach them to have a watch party and invite their friends. We've got some people. We had one guy, I was doing a thing and we did an attendance thing, and I said, tell us how many people are on with you today. And we had one person, two person, three people, so we could get a number of people who were watching on the screen, same screen. Guy in our church named Richard said, I'm having a watch party and I've got 43 people on my watch party. How do I report that? Isn't that cool? That one guy in our congregation had 43 people in a watch party because he'd invited a bunch of people to watch. And doing that became a vehicle for 43 people to be watching online together. Supply people with content that they can share. Put up a good meme, a good video. Make sure it's useful, that it's high quality, it's theologically intact, so that you're doing good teaching. As you know, the power of a meme is to become true in our culture. You can post a false quote on a meme over the face of the person that you're misquoting, and people will believe that that person said it. So there's huge power in this. So use those mediums carefully, but use them well. Design a meme and put a quote there. Teach people the difference between liking and sharing. If they like your stuff, they're stroking your ego. That's really nice. But if you really want them to be helpful and they think it's meaningful, tell them to share it. Put it on their page. That's how things go viral. Liking doesn't help you much. Sharing helps a lot. If you want you to get your church's message out, all your people going like, makes them feel involved, makes you feel like they like the stuff, but it isn't really helpful. So you have to teach people. The other thing is teach people to post what they're doing. So rather than you posting, there's a Bible study tonight on the Psalms online. Click here if you want to be involved. On Thursday morning, the day after the Bible study, have people post, hey, I was at the Psalms Bible study last night. We talked about this. And that way on their page, there's information about it. And people see that they're going to Bible study. Then next week they can post, hey, there's a Bible study. Remember the one I talked about last week, that next unit's here. If you'd like to come, click here, and they can share it. They can build relationships and information if they'll post what they're doing, not you post what the church is doing. So teach people. Equipping is so important. Remember, Facebook really started out as the yellow pages. We would post an event, we'd post information about the church dinner or Christmas Eve services, but now it's really about interacting with people. So ask questions, put something up. I would question every week. We're doing narrative lectionary this week is Hannah's song, the birth of Samuel. And so the question this week is, when was a time in your life when you experienced such joy that it simply overflowed? That's the question. So we're going to post that on Facebook this week. And then we're going to ask people to share when my child was born, or all these kind of different things, when I was doing this, the day I got married, or the whatever it was I accomplished and things. So people are going to post these stories. It makes them come out of the woodworks. And then when you see somebody, if they're in a comment thing, one of the greatest things you can do is stop commenting back. So if somebody hits a comment, and you can go reply. If you get something, and especially a new person, don't reply. Or if you do reply, don't limit it to their reply. Click their name. It'll take you to their page, even if you're not their friend. Click message and send them a personal message, and move from a public conversation where now you're chatting in a foyer to a personal conversation where it's actually a one-to-one, and you can introduce yourself and say, hey, Jane Doe, I saw you commented on this, and I don't know you very well. I'm Dave, and I'm the pastor. I've been here a few years, and I'm really interested in this. And I'm interested in your story. I really thought that was an interesting comment you made. Can you tell me more? See if you can create a relationship. So constantly be thinking one directional, no, two directional, yes. And whatever you can do to cultivate that is very possible. The other thing that I find really helpful, and I've gotten 2 blog awards for my local congregation, and they've both been noticed because of traffic to the blog. And the way I generate traffic to the blog is I write a blog on the Sunday to follow sermon every Tuesday or Wednesday. I post it, and I put it up on the Narrative Lectionary site, because we use Narrative Lectionary. You could be on the Revised Common Lectionary site, post it there. Post an outline of your thematic stuff of your sermon in a well-written 4-paragraph article, and send it out to your congregation, and do it by posting it on your website and on your Facebook page or Instagram, whatever. And to read it, they've got to move from your Facebook page to click the link and read it on your website. It drives traffic to your website. Traffic to your website from outside links is the fastest way to move up a Google search. And if somebody's in your town, let's suppose you're in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and somebody moves to town and they want to find a church and they say, Church, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. You do not want to be on page 5 of that search. And if they're looking for a Lutheran one, maybe you can move up because there's only so many Lutheran, but most people aren't like that committed. They're just looking for churches. If you're on page 5, they're never going to see you. So find your way up. The easiest way is to be sure that if people are active on Facebook, you're driving them when possible to your website, because web traffic determines Google search rankings. So make sure it's up to date, make sure it's active, make sure that if somebody comes to your website, there's engaging things, be sure there's a contact thing. So if somebody comes, they can click and fill out that they were there. You can add them to your MailChimp or constant contact list, or however you do that, and work to get those things out. But this is something that takes some time and energy.
And it's worth, and I will add, one of the things that happened early on is when we were living into the season, I realized you could posts on Facebook. And so I did an experiment with my wife's church one week. And I said, well, what happens if I spend $8? So I did, and reached all sorts of people that we would have never reached. So the next week I said, let's do 10 and see what happens. And the next week, 12. And by the way, you could get carried away, and I never do, but I will add, it was an amazing thing because I have had folks say to me, I appreciated the invitation. And I had to stop and say, invitation. And then I realized what they saw was that I had boosted a post. They responded, they showed up. And so you can really reach people, and it doesn't cost a lot. You'd mentioned the yellow pages earlier, Dave, and of course today people generally don't use them, but
even keep them.
and keep them. I did. I mean, I've known people who use them.
Pages, recycle bin.
I've known folks who propped up furniture and sat on them while they drove their car, for height. But the beauty of this is, if you think about how much we used to spend on a yellow page ad that was not interactive, that may or may not have been seen, you can spend a lot less money and have a huge impact. And this, the one church we were talking that you had lifted up, they've budgeted $15 a week for boosting posts. That's less than $800 a year.
They boost 3 posts a week for $5 a boost. There's 3 different posts, and then it's not a lot of money, and huge impact. And just, I think the thing to remember is, just because something's free doesn't mean you should only use what's free.
And the great part of the boost is that you can also give some thought to it. Are we targeting a zip code? Are we targeting the friends of our friends? Who are we trying to reach?
Yep.
And you have all sorts of ways of having a focus and having an impact.
Yep.
And relatively little money, but it is worth investing.
I want to keep this on schedule here, Richard. There's one thing I think that's very important to talk about with regard to social media, because it is so public. And I'd just like you to talk a little bit to leaders thinking about how they're online and what their public presence is about.
Yeah. And, there's the saying, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But I have to say, what happens on the internet does not stay on the internet.
No, it does. It goes away. It doesn't go away. In some ways, it stays.
Yes, it stays on the internet, but it goes beyond our original intended audience potentially.
And beyond.
And so we really, as leaders in the church, we always want to say that if we are servants of the gospel, if we're representing Christ, that whatever we post is something that will help build up the body of Christ. So
we've seen leaders who said something and published something with the F word or something very derogatory about somebody, and they said, well, it was my personal page. No, actually it was your public page.
Yeah, so it's always good to recognize that as we're public figures by virtue of the fact that we're online, that we use whatever we do online, whether personal or intentionally public, ministry or private, our personal site, that whatever it is, we're doing it for the sake of the gospel. That we're
always ask the question, as I post this, is Christ pleased with what I'm saying? I just think it's worth always asking that question. Well, as we finish up here, Richard, on social media, I just want to encourage everybody to be intentional about this, to generate relationships. And it does take practice. And there are ways to learn. There are people doing entire courses on online engagement now that you can begin to learn from. Fresh Expressions, for example, right now is having a 6-week online engagement course that they're offering right as we're getting ready to do this. And you can watch for other things. So just know that there are ways to get better at this. And we all need to do this. Richard and I have been exploring this for a while. We're far from experts, but we actually have a new book coming out in November. You can go to day8strategies.com and order it. And the order's there. The book is at the layout printing phase. So it'll be out early November. It should be back from the printer well before November 15th. And the day it arrives, we'll start shipping the next day. You can enter workshop code or coupon code rather, workshop when you order, and you get 10% off that. And that's true for any books you order from there. Just type it in and it'll come off. And if you do a bulk order where you get 20% off anyway, type workshop in, you get 10% more off. It's about information and sharing, not so much about how much money we're going to make off of this. In fact, Richard, I think yours is going to the Synod's Mission Fund. Is that right?
Yeah, any profits that I might make off of this is going to go directly to our Synod's Mission Fund, and so we're reinvesting in the ministry of our synod.
So, we hope this is a helpful resource. It's something new. It's going to be incomplete by the time a year or two goes by. Everything we did, we'll have to do a revised edition because we'll have learned so much that we'll be embarrassed about the book. But right now, we're very proud of it and excited about the conversations it's going to generate. With that in mind, we're going to finish up with just that question. What conversations do you want to generate? We're going to pause and give you the same chance to reflect for just a few minutes on what caught your attention and said, aha, what we said about social media, what was engaging in a way that maybe challenged you, and some ideas that come to mind as you consider moving forward in the setting that you serve. And as we finish this section and pause, when we come back, we'll be off the synchronous viewing of a recording, and we'll be live streaming with a Q&A with you. So we're hoping that we can take advantage of what we've done during this recorded part of our time together to spend time interacting with you, hearing from you, learning from you, sharing ideas with you, answering questions, raising questions of our own. So thanks for being with us, Richard. I'll leave it to you to say goodbye and finalize this as we prepare to transition.
Yeah, and I'll just say thank you that we are a community together. We are learning together. And please know how much of a blessing that all of you are to us. So I do hope to see you back when we're doing Q&A. But more than anything, I just really want to always remember you how much we treasure and value the relationship we have together. So be blessed and be well and have joy in what you do.
Absolutely. And thanks for being with us. We'll see you in the Q&A section in a few minutes. Bye-bye.